How did the clerk in Ephesus quell the mob formed against Paul? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Acts on Walking Through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Acts chapter 19, verses 28 to 41, but before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Acts chapter 19, verse 28, but if you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Acts chapter 19, beginning of verse 28. Now when they heard this, they were full of wrath and cried out, saying, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. So the whole city was filled with confusion and rushed into the theater with one accord, having seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, Paul's travel companions. And when Paul wanted to go into the people, the disciples would not allow him. Then some of the officials of Asia, who were his friends, sent to him pleading that he would not venture into the theater. Some therefore cried one thing and some another, for the assembly was confused, and most of them did not know why they had come together. And they drew Alexander out of the multitude, the Jews putting him forward. And Alexander motioned with his hands and wanted to make his defense to the people. But when they found out that he was a Jew, all with one accord cried out for about 2 hours, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. And when the city clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, Men of Ephesus, what man is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple guardian of the great goddess Diana, and of the image which fell down from Zeus? Therefore, since these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rashly. For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers or of temples, nor blasphemers of your goddess. Therefore, if Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a case against anyone, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you have any other inquiry to make, it shall be determined in a lawful assembly. For we are in danger of being called in question for today's uproar, there being no reason which we may give to account for this disorderly gathering. And when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly. In our last lesson, we discussed how Demetrius, a silversmith, had stirred up people against Paul because he felt threatened for his livelihood and the honor that Ephesus bestowed on Diana, the Greek god of the moon and the hunt, due to Paul's teaching against idolatry. In one sense, Demetrius was right concerning the idols, for if more Ephesians turned away from idolatry, then his business, at least as it concerned the making of idols, would have been threatened. Idolatry was a big business, and it was in danger in Ephesus due to Paul's preaching there for over 2 years. However, this action by Demetrius showed one of the ways our hearts are hardened against God, which is through the love of money. There was plenty of things that Demetrius and his silversmiths could have made if they would have become Christians. It just couldn't be idols. But alas, Demetrius' speech caused quite a stir and angered many people, so much so that the entire city came together at the theater, pictures of which are now on the screen. The crowd couldn't get their hands on Paul, so they grabbed his companions here, Gaius and Aristarchus. These two men were Macedonians, and Aristarchus we're going to read of in other places. The name Gaius we'll see in other places too, but they're likely different men, as Gaius wasn't an uncommon name. Likely wanting to protect his friends and wanting to defend the gospel, Paul desired to go into the theater, but the brethren in Ephesus wouldn't allow him to go. The question is, why not? Because they knew that if he went, he would likely be killed. But doesn't Christ say that sometimes we have to die for his cause? Yes, but that doesn't mean that we have to be foolish about situations and get ourselves needlessly killed. Paul entering that theater wouldn't likely have resulted in Gaius and Aristarchus being released. In fact, it could very well have gotten all three killed. And the people gathered in the theater were so unruly, they weren't going to respond to the gospel in that condition, so Paul's likely death wouldn't have caused anyone to actually obey Christ. Yes, the brethren at Ephesus wanted the release of Gaius and Aristarchus, But there was a better way of doing that than sending Paul into the lion's den, so to speak. Those in the theater, though, had been stirred up, but they didn't really understand why they were there. Yes, they may have had a general idea, but why they were gathered in the theater and not some other place was unknown to them. The situation was so volatile that the Jews sent Alexander to speak to the crowd in order that the Jews in Ephesus not be blamed for the situation. You see, the Jews, like Paul, taught against idolatry, so it might have been expected for the Jews to be lumped in with Paul, which is something they didn't want. When the crowd found out that he was a Jew, though, they wouldn't allow him to speak, yelling, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians," for 2 hours. 2 hours! And so you can see why the Ephesian brethren didn't want Paul to go into the theater. Finally, the city clerk quieted the crowd down in order to explain the situation to them. He first appealed to common sense and civic pride, and then to the rule of law. He asked them, what man is there that doesn't know that Ephesus is the city of Diana, whose image fell down from Zeus? Of course, this isn't true, but the Ephesians believed it was. Therefore, the clerk continued, since the image fell from Zeus, do you really think that Ephesus was in danger of rejecting Diana on the whole? Thus they shouldn't do anything rashly, that is, without thinking. And if Zeus was really a god, and Diana's image really did fall from heaven, this argument makes sense. The clerk went on to say that since these men, being Gaius, Aristarchus, and Paul, are not robbers of temples, nor blasphemers of your goddess, even though technically they were, as they taught against idolatry, the clerk concludes that whatever charges Demetrius had should be brought in a court of law instead of dealt with in a theater by a mob. If any other inquiry needed to be made, then a lawful assembly needed to be called for that purpose. This goes to show us that even under the Roman Empire, there were lawful and unlawful assemblies. Lawful assemblies are those that are scheduled to deal with matters in a civil and organized way, while unlawful ones were spontaneous and often resulted in disorganized mob rule, where justice and decorum were tossed aside, allowing the emotions to take over and rule. This clerk was concerned that this assembly, which wasn't properly called to settle this dispute, would cause the Romans to come in and investigate what happened here, something that neither the clerk nor the people wanted to happen. Hearing the reasoning of the clerk, the assembly was dismissed, and even though the text doesn't say, we can safely assume that Gaius and Aristarchus were released. So in this case, the situation resolved itself without Paul having to step in. Now this, of course, wasn't guaranteed, and if the situation would have devolved further, perhaps the Ephesian brethren would have acted. But in this case, they didn't have to. Everyone was safe, and Paul could continue teaching the gospel. We'll find out where he travels next, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Acts chapter 20, verses 1 to 16, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.